Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek. I'm John Harrington, editor of PRWeek UK, and today's podcast is all about undoubtedly the biggest PR agency story of 2026. The merger of global agency networks Golin and Ketchum was finalised in June, creating a new industry titan, Golin Ketchum. That, of course, followed the acquisition of Golin owner IPG by Ketchum parent Omnicom last year. To discuss the merger and what lies ahead, I'm delighted to welcome Ondine Whittington, President of Golin Ketchum and Virgo Health London and former London President at Golin. Hi, Ondine, how are you?
Hi, good. Thanks for having me, John.
Pleasure. Good to see you here. So, I thought before we go into the merger, we could talk about what we were talking about earlier on, which is Cannes. Obviously, still a lot of talk about that and all the lessons. I just wondered how you found it this year, really, and what were some of the highlights for you?
Yeah, so I love Cannes. It was very hot, but I absolutely love Cannes. I think it's a real privilege to be able to spend a week immersed in our industry, whether you're kind of in the work and you're walking around the Palais or whether you're in some of the big activations, obviously on the beaches. I think it's an incredible experience to be able to take that time to kind of listen and learn and talk to industry peers about what's going on. And, obviously we won a bit as well, which was quite nice. So yeah, all in all, I think it's a great week. I think it's interesting because I think Cannes increasingly sort of has two sides to it. I think you have this sort of festival of creativity and celebration of the work, but undoubtedly it's definitely becoming, I guess, really kind of a trade fair. I mean, it really is kind of probably what's becoming the biggest sort of B2B industry event of our year. And I think in doing so, kind of the type of people that are congregating there is changing. So it's interesting to see that dynamic, actually.
Absolutely. And, as you alluded to, you obviously won for relationship aid for Specsavers. Congratulations. And obviously, as a lot of people know, previously, a couple of years ago, and you're on this podcast, actually, talking about the misheard version also for Specsavers. So that's really positive. I mean, how do you kind of keep that creative partnership fresh, really, and come up with new PR campaigns when it's a client you've been working with for a while?
Yeah, well, I think that's actually what it is. The sort of longevity of the relationship is what allows us to, I think, have creative flexibility to come up with great ideas. And I think whether it's Specsavers or even ASICS, for example, where again, year on year, we've had really great work shortlisted. This year, we got a bronze and a silver, and actually were shortlisted for the titanium as well for Undropped. I think when you look at those two clients, it's because we have these incredible partnerships and collaboration that I think we understand deeply their business and their objectives. And I think what that allows you to do is kind of quite freely ideate without the need for a brief. So we're often going to the client with ideas. And alongside that, I think having those senior stakeholders on agency side, whether that's our chief creative officer, Al Wood, or our chief strategy officer, Kat Arnold, or just the client leaders, being able to build those relationships and steward those ideas through the business, I think that's so fundamental because a lot of that is about trust. So a lot of those ideas that win at Cannes, or we definitely win at Cannes, are things that often were originally too risky or deemed too dangerous for clients to do. And it takes a partnership of a client trusting you to take them through the business, to protect the idea, and for you to work in lockstep with them to be able to do that. So a lot of those ideas, I think, probably maybe 4 or 5 times in their kind of process of conception through to execution nearly got, shelved because someone in the business was like, oh, we can't do that, it's too risky, or it's not something we'd ordinarily have done. So I think that partnership and being that kind of longevity of it is just so fundamental to the creative process.
It's a really good point, actually. And thinking about it, I wonder if it's a bit of a challenge to the sort of project model, because it's got to be quite hard to have those sort of relationships if you're bringing a new agency in for every new campaign.
It really is. And I think we find that because, we win business with clients who obviously buy us because they see that work. And often I think we get challenges along the way because it isn't just about a great idea. It's so much more than that. As I say, it's about that partnership. So you're absolutely right. I think this kind of model, perhaps unfortunately, that we're moving to with this lack of retainers and project-based work isn't necessarily fueling the best work, I think.
Yeah, really interesting point. And going back to Cannes, we will come on to the merger, but I do think it's interesting. Some of the criticisms of Cannes, particularly as there is a lot of change, sadly redundancies and a lot of difficulty across the whole marketing communications world at the moment, that perhaps this big extravagant event in the French Riviera can look a little bit out of place, perhaps. Do you sort of sympathise with those?
I can sympathise, I think, if you haven't been or you're looking in, because I think obviously optically, you see a lot of that stuff, but I think you do get out what you put in. So I think for me, as I say, like the richness of the conversations you have there, the people that you meet and the networking you do, I don't think you can do that anywhere else. house. What I do think, and sort of I touched on, is that you've kind of got these two different parts of Cannes, where you've got this festival of creativity, which is obviously where it originated from, and a celebration of the work, and then what really is a place to do business. And I think what we need to be careful of is that it doesn't become completely disconnected. And I think you've got obviously C-suite and CMOs there who are buying the work, but I think probably aren't necessarily seeing and celebrating the work. I think it would be good to see us being able to connect those dots more closely. So, for example, like Cannes Lion in recent years have introduced new categories into the awards, like creative effectiveness, which I think draw a harder line between the creative work and what probably is sitting in CMO's business plans around the hard business impact. I think, more of that would actually help, I think, to join those dots more closely, like the work coming off the stage into some of the beaches, more discussion around it. Otherwise, I worry that kind of piece between, the conversations around performance marketing and ROI suddenly become disconnected to actually great creatively effective work, which I firmly believe still drives huge business impact. So I think that's the only thing for me. It's like, how do we start to make sure those don't become completely different events going on in Cannes?
It's a really good point. Right, I think we should move on to the merger now. So, going back a little bit to the beginning of this, for those who haven't been following, what was the kind of reason really given for the merger? A skeptic might say this was mostly cost-cutting and consolidation, but is there a real sense that bringing together Golin and Ketchum can be kind of greater than the sum of its parts?
Obviously it wasn't my decision.
I know.
So I can't probably tell you like the background as to why that decision was made specifically around obviously Golin and Ketchum. But what I will say is it, in reality, it's made a lot of sense. And I think when you look at kind of the spectrum of agencies that obviously came together as part of the IPG world and the Omnicom world, I think, just like obviously Porter has evolved into Fleischmann, I think there were natural synergies between agencies. And we were definitely an ability to see how we could be stronger together versus the sum of the parts. It's not a cost-cutting exercise, and I'm not going to get into the weeds of kind of what and how that's worked, but obviously, we have found positions and retained all of our senior leadership team. That has been a critical part of this. So it was about how do we bring the best of both together and create something even better. And I think we have, to some degree, achieved that already. So I think, I think probably the decision makers were looking and thinking, what's complementary here? What makes sense? And how do we bring them together in a meaningful way? Creating, I guess, less complexity for clients, simplicity, but also not losing anything in terms of the brands and the value and the equity they've got in the marketplace.
Great. No, thank you. We'll come on to definitely some of those things a bit later on. It must have been a huge challenge. How was the sort of merger handled internally, and how was it possible to kind of communicate all of these things effectively with staff?
Yeah. So I think obviously there's the merger part, which has happened latterly, but actually, cast your mind back, really for us, the acquisition happened, or was announced anyway, back in November 2025 in terms of Omnicom's intention to buy IPG or acquire IPG. And so this journey's been pretty long actually, and quite different in terms of the way we've had to manage through it. So, last year, obviously there was a huge amount of uncertainty, would we even be acquired? What would that mean? Undoubtedly we could see the spectrum of agencies that sat within that acquired mix, and where did we fall and how would that work? So many questions. And I think in the first instance, it was about letting the teams get distracted. It was like, this may never happen. Obviously, we didn't know what the alternative was, which also came with obviously concerns and worries. But it was about how do we keep the team focused? How do we communicate at the right time in the right way, not get ahead of ourselves, but also not come unstuck by being, deemed to be untransparent or not communicating effectively. So it has been such a journey of evolution with so many different milestones. And I think critical to that has just been how close we've remained to the business to get that temperature check of how people have been feeling. And so we've done so many things across that period of time. I did a weekly internal comms newsletter that went out every week, even when we didn't really have much to say. It was just that point of connectivity where every week we asked for feedback, what was on people's minds, what was worrying them. We did an Ask Me Anything Q&A, which people fed into anonymously, and we sent out every week the answers, even when we just said, look, we don't know, genuinely. And I think that level of connectivity and understanding how people were feeling allowed us just to evolve our internal comms and how we handled it in a way that sort of met people where they were. But it's not been like a one size fits all. The journey has evolved over time, and we've had to adapt to that as well.
Kind of more generally, what have you found has been the kind of best ways of creating this sort of united agency, if you like, especially given Golin and Ketchum, both sort of historic names, both go back many decades. It's a real cultural challenge, I think. And let's face it, in recent years, Golin has generally been performing more strongly than Ketchum overall. Could it look like, this is one side dominating the other? I mean, there must be a lot of things you have to consider here.
Absolutely. I mean, first and foremost, obviously, as you say, there's such equity in both brands. And I think, again, not my decision around the naming, but that very much was at the forefront of not losing that equity. And I think the approach that has been taken right from the word go when we knew the merger was happening was like, genuinely, how do we bring the best of both together? And I said to the team at the beginning, I said, it's so interesting, you're getting to see behind the bonnet of another agency, and that's, you never get that. But I think that was the approach I said to take. Like, we need to be curious, we need to go into this not assuming anything just because we've read about it in the industry about how one agency performs or one doesn't. It's like, let's be really open to thinking about where the best bits can come from and creating something better as a result of that. So that approach, I think, has kind of been really important in terms of, as you say, like making sure both brands had an equal stake and people feeling that they could kind of have an equal share in it has been really important. And then, as I say, like I think in the UK, particularly in London, like that they're very complementary organisations. I feel quite fortunate in that respect, in that we didn't have massive duplication of roles. Ketchum had sort of talent perhaps where we didn't, and vice versa. And so that leadership structure that we created was very natural and organic and played to people's strengths and actually created more opportunities for people as well. So we, when I went into it, it's like my goal was to make sure we didn't lose any of our top talent, that we created meaningful roles. And obviously we've done that. Actually, we haven't lost anyone, whether it's we've kept them within the Golin Ketchum family or whether we've found roles within the wider network. That's been really, really important part of this.
Yeah, no, that definitely. And you mentioned clients earlier on, and there's been talk about client conflicts, such as some P&G, Unilever brands. How have you kind of handled those, if not conflicts, certainly challenges that come with that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously the client piece has been at the absolute forefront of all of this. And, one of the things, again, when talking to the team about as we headed into it, it was like, I think it's very easy to fall into the trap of becoming incredibly internally focused because you've got lots of complex stuff going on and problems and issues to solve. And actually part of it was saying to the team, don't get your heads down. Like, you've got to keep looking out, keep looking at your clients, keep looking at the market. Don't take your eye off that ball. It's really important because naturally our clients have come with very sensible questions. Are you distracted? Am I going to have the same team? What does this mean? What's the benefit? And so I think that's always been really important in all of this. So actually when we went into the merger and we looked at our client base and we thought about how we problem solve for things or had to find solutions, that all came quite naturally because I think we could see the opportunities. So all of those, as I say, there weren't many, but where we had conflict, we've really carefully managed those in collaboration with our clients, and all of them are resolved. So we haven't lost any clients through the merger, which is brilliant.
Sorry to be downbeat, but I feel I should ask about redundancies. Can you say much about sort of how many, broadly there have been and where they've sort of affected the business, and has there even been any kind of divisional changes as a result of the merger? Perhaps something like, we haven't heard about Ketchum's public affairs work, for example.
Sure.
Is there any detail you can give us on
So
those?
I can't obviously get into sort of numbers or what we have and haven't done. As I say, the businesses were really complementary, and so actually there has been a really natural fit between the two. There hasn't been duplications of roles. So, from a restructure perspective, that isn't something we've had to do. I think like any business at the moment, I don't think this is just the case for any of us going through these kind of mergers or changes. I think everyone's looking at their workforce and thinking about how do we set ourselves up in the right way for the future. And so, we're in a similar situation to lots of people. But I think, as I say, we've been fortunate in that we haven't had that duplication. It's been a natural kind of merging of the organisations together, and sort of high talent in some places and not others. So yeah, great.
And actually, it'd be interesting to talk about staff and what you've been doing in terms of your priorities for training and expertise. And maybe a lot of this goes way beyond the merger itself, and this is just what everyone in the industry is doing. But what do you sort of see as your priorities actually for staff skills and where you want them to be focusing?
Yeah, so I think, as you say, this isn't kind of a merger thing. I think we've been on a bit of a journey over the last year or so, and I'm talking again from a legacy Golin point of view, but I think that two things. I think what's really exciting, and again, was probably the topic of most conversations, was the value of earned and how important that was now in terms of the marketing mix and how budgets and investment are going into earned. But I think actually how people perceive earned is quite interesting. I think there's this kind of dichotomy of people that see it as earned as a discipline and that end-to-end kind of idea to amplification. And then you have others that are going, well, that's just the bit at the end, the channel stuff that you do. And so I think, obviously how we want to position ourselves as that end-to-end agency that can do the ideas, that can do the amplification and understand that new media ecosystem that we're living in. But that's quite a shift, I think, for the teams in terms of like how you create work like that and how you sell work like that. So a lot of the work we've been doing over the last year is around that evolved media ecosystem. So you might recall we launched a report back maybe over a year or so ago called Core Impact, which is like, what does that new model of influence look like? How does news travel through those different sources? And obviously AI being part of that. And so a lot of the work, I'd say probably 90% of the training and investment we've made is about upskilling the team in that and being able to talk fluently about that with clients and understand how we measure it, how we prove the value of it to clients. That's been probably the mainstay of the work that we're doing. And I think that's going to continue as we sort of go through the next 6 months and beyond.
Right. Sounds good. So moving on to another topic, Brooklyn Brothers, I was really interested to see that that's been relaunched back in London. I mean, what was the thinking behind here? People that don't know, it's a sort of creative agency that's been part of Golin for a long time, and it was closed in London in 2022. So yeah, why is it back? What are the thoughts behind that?
Yeah, so as I say, I think the merger is an interesting one because one of the things I thought was really important is like you don't get many opportunities, particularly when you're in sort of big agency world, to take a bit of a step back and think about like, how do we want to build our business going forward for the clients that we have and future clients? And I think that it did give us a moment to do that. So yes, obviously we're bringing two agencies together, but it kind of gave an opportunity to pause and go, actually, what does this need to look like more holistically? And I think what we saw were certain clients that were buying different kinds of services in different ways and with different commercial models around them. And whilst Brooklyn in London are closed, it actually continued to be an entity in New York. And it can continue to kind of evolve its offering, where they were an earned first creative agency, to something slightly different. And we kind of looked at that and said, actually, there's a real value in the market for something like that, which is basically an agency that's really at that intersect of social, culture and entertainment. So it really is anchored into still being a creative agency, but actually specifically about how you get into fandoms, create fans for clients and brands. So it's a slightly different model. We've set it up in a slightly different way. So it's a very dedicated, highly senior team, quite lean, that's very much been infused with AI from a starting point, but also then supplemented with real sort of turn on, off, really deep sort of cultural tastemakers that sit within some of these niche sub-communities that our clients and brands are really thinking about how they align, how they participate in, how they're part of. So it's really exciting. It's a slightly different model. As I say, there were some clients that naturally were buying that from us, and it just felt making that into something that was quite intentional, and then thinking about how we go forward, the kinds of agency, the kind of clients that might buy those services. I think it gives us a different space to compete in what is becoming obviously quite a competitive marketplace.
I could see that. And how do you sort of see it specifically working with Golin Ketchum? Is it a sort of add-ons? Almost sounds like underplaying it a little bit, but is it effectively a kind of, if you want to get this specialism as part of the overall offer?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's not really an add-on at all. It really does, and we want it to feel intention, like a real standalone agency. Obviously, KJ Flynn, who ran the consumer practice in Golin, has gone across to set this up. And again, this was again part of like, where are people's passion points and how do we create those opportunities for people? And so it really is a standalone offering. And I think, as I say, it's interesting as we see briefs come in, we're already like, oh, that's a Brooklyn Brothers brief, or that's and actually I think it allows us, as I say, to compete and play perhaps in spaces where smaller agencies or more niche boutique agencies are, that we perhaps weren't able to when we were coming in as a sort of bigger kind of networked agency. So yeah.
That's really interesting. So how does that sort of work in practice? I'm quite interested in this. That's that sense of Brooklyn Brothers. Do you see it as a kind of almost like you've got this indie agency that's kind of part of your, your
Yeah.
armory, if you like.
Definitely. And I think we're trying to set it up in a way which allows it to kind of move at a different pace and speed and all of those things, which is not, it's challenging because obviously they're still part of the network. They're still part of Golin Ketchum. So they're still part of obviously the group. But the intention is to try and allow it to operate in a slightly different way. As I say, both from the point of view of kind of some of the speed and agility of a kind of smaller agency, but also, with a different commercial setup where we can perhaps offer clients a different kind of model, which perhaps can compete with some of those smaller shops.
Yeah, it's interesting. And thinking about it, actually, one of the debates I hear from people quite a lot is, are we in a stage where the future is the sort of smaller indies, or actually do you need the scale? And often it depends who you ask. But it's interesting that, you seem to really recognise the value of that kind of the things that a smaller independent can bring and try to incorporate that into what you do is interesting.
I mean, it's interesting because I think when you're looking at you look at the whole thing, we've now got obviously the Golin Ketchum as sort of the master brand, and we've got Virgo and now Brooklyn Brothers. And I think we've been talking a lot about kind of, it's like the scale, the sophistication and the specialism. And that's kind of what you've got to try and offer now to clients. So when you look at it through that lens, it's like, you're trying to hit all of those boxes in the right way. It's interesting you say about the indies, and is it their time, and I think they're making hay while the sun shines, while we're obviously going through these kind of big industry mergers and acquisitions. But I do think one of the things that, whether you're Brooklyn Brothers or Golin Ketchum, the sophistication of kind of the technology and the platforms and what clients are asking for, I think that's where perhaps in the future some of those independents might find it harder to compete, because I think those things are becoming a requirement of how we're doing business. So and that will still fuel the Brooklyn Brothers as well.
Sure. Right. So looking ahead then, what do you see as your kind of biggest priorities for the business over the next sort of 12 months, say? And where do you see the kind of most significant areas of growth, I suppose?
Yeah. So obviously, merger is sort of like semi-done. Like we've got through the first hurdle of obviously creating an integrated leadership team. And so there's kind of two major priorities. We've got a plan for the rest of the year, which is really fundamentally about properly integrating. So, at the moment it's really exciting because we're bringing together the teams at different places in different ways, in the practice areas, in new business. And I think one of the areas we're really focused in on is the culture of the organisation. And I think one of the things that Legacy Golin has been very good at, I would say, is how we've used culture to really drive our performance and our growth. And Ketchum also has a really strong sort of cultural background and kind of equity in that. And so I think for us, it's about how do we continue to do that? What's the culture we're creating that's going to continue to drive really strong business performance? And that's really important. So we've got a big plan around that for the rest of the year. The other piece is obviously unlocking the potential for our current clients. I think one of the most exciting parts of this is, I'm sitting there going, I've now got even more clients, even more people that are really talented. How do we make sure we're really bringing those things together? It's interesting because both organisations actually have really tenured clients. So, some of them 20 odd years, for example, which is brilliant. But also, I think you always run into the risk with those clients that they're like, oh, do we need something new? Do we need something fresh? Maybe we should look around. We've been with you a really long time. And I think what's exciting is we're now in a position where we can say to those clients, you can have all of that longevity and history and corporate understanding and background, but actually we're going to throw a few fresh things into that mix for you. And I think where we're already doing that, you can see the potential for growth and opportunity. So that's really important in terms of unlocking that. And then I think other priorities around the network. So obviously we're now part of the biggest marketing network in the world. And I think we are really keen to get out into that and think about how we build partnerships with different parts of that mix. So the advertising agencies, the media buying agencies, how we're kind of looking at their clients, how we can partner with them, which is really interesting actually. And it comes back to that point about how our teams are able to sell earned work with those kind of interagency teams. So yeah, those are the main things which, feel quite short term, but I think we need to be at the moment because there's like a 6-month plan that we've got. And then I think as we come to the end of the year, we'll look further ahead.
Great. And it's interesting, I was going to ask actually if you considered the integration to be over.
No, far from it. I think we were just at the beginning of that journey. As I say, I think when I got the role, I think it was like 10 weeks to actual launch. So, as I say, we covered a lot of ground, and I think, we've got ourselves into an amazing position with a really strong leadership team. But yeah, the work starts now, really.
Yeah. And kind of talking generally about the industry, I mean, how would you describe the sector currently and the opportunities for PR agencies?
I think the market's really tough, and I don't mean that from the point of view of like, are there pitches out there, or are we winning or losing? I think it's just, I think there has become a greater competitive set that we are up against, and I think some confusion in our client base around where they're buying work from. And it comes back to this point I was saying, it's like there's this amazing opportunity that it feels like everyone's talking about earned and the importance of earned, and that's a great opportunity for us. But in doing that, obviously, everyone's kind of piled in to get a part of it. So advertising agencies, social agencies, influencer agencies, talent acquisition agencies. And I think clients are a bit like, what are we buying here? Like, how are we buying the work? So actually, that I think is really challenging. And I think how we are showing up to show how we can, as I say, with the discipline that knows how to do this end to end, and that we can prove our value. I think that's why it's got tougher. But I don't necessarily think that's also a bad thing. I think what it will do is make sure that the agencies that can do that and can set a standard for our industry will step to the challenge and be able to do it. And those that can't maybe won't survive. And at the moment, there's quite a proliferation of lots of agencies. So I think over the next few years, it'll be interesting to see how that all falls out.
You mentioned those other types of agencies that kind of wants to eat some of this, some of our lunch, frankly. I mean, are they talking about geo and stuff like that as much as we are? Or do you think they was conscious of this, or are they just looking at things from a totally different perspective?
When you look at that, kind of, as I say, if you think about the sort of end to end of what earned looks like, right from the idea conception through to like the amplification, I think a lot of those agencies might sit at different parts of that kind of chain. So you've probably got ad agencies who are obviously very good at kind of conceptual creative ideas, and I think increasingly absolutely understand what an earned idea can look like. I think where they might start to struggle is when they get into that amplification and not buying it but having to earn it, and that's where we end up getting sort of parachuted in. You've got influencer agencies and talent sort of where they're sitting at a different part of that spectrum. So I think that's the thing. It's I think, whether it's, the AI piece in geo or anything, it's like, actually, I think those agencies can have part of it. But I think the win is where you can kind of own that whole piece, which I genuinely think good PR agencies are able to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And, we've spoken about clients. It'd be good to sort of discuss a little bit about how their needs have changed most significantly in recent times. I mean, obviously I mentioned geo, all the sort of the importance of AI search generally. I mean, what would you sort of say have been the most significant changes you've seen?
Yeah, I mean, I think a few things. I think increasingly clients are looking for agencies to come up with solutions to their business problems, which often are, they don't want a cookie cutter approach. So I think often the briefs that we're getting, which is great, is like, we've got this issue, how are you going to solve it for us? And I think it's on us to then think about how we do that. So increasingly, I think integrated teams of specialists, not necessarily from one sector specific or one specialism, or more and more we're pitching at the moment, I'd say 2 of the 3 pitches have got really interesting, diverse teams around them from different parts of our organisation, all playing a role, because I think our clients' businesses are becoming like that. They're not as siloed as they once were. And some of that is driven on the other side by a need for cost efficiencies and finding ways to do things differently. And I think that's the other, pressure we're definitely feeling. But how do we kind of step up to, essentially the budgets aren't getting bigger, but how are we still delivering more value, which is where obviously all the AI pieces come to play, and how we're trying to find efficiencies in our workflows or optimize things that we're doing. So there's that side of it particularly. So yeah, I think those are kind of some of the main things. And then, as you say, there's kind of like how AI is just interplaying into kind of our ability to kind of target media and be in the right places and all of that, which I think increasingly is probably becoming an expectation versus a sort of a value add. I think it's a bit of a hygiene factor now. It's like, if you're not doing your media targeting and creating media strategies that intrinsically just have that built in, you're probably missing a trick. I think clients almost are not even willing to pay. Do you know what I mean? It's just part of what we've always done now.
Yeah, wow. I was really interested in what you said in May. Remember we were on the round table? This idea that you sort of identify the problem of finding kind of meaningful growth in accounts and sort of profitable growth, not just growth. It'd be good to discuss that a little bit, because I felt that was a really interesting point about the problems of, there might be more work out there, but it doesn't necessarily mean you get as much of a benefit as you should do, perhaps.
Yeah, I think so. I think there is, as I say, I think there's a lot of work out. There's not, we've had a lot of requests to pitch for things. And I think it's when you're in that situation, as we talked about, with very project-based work, that's perhaps quite one-dimensional in what they're asking for, and, not necessarily having the ability to grow from it. So I'm not averse to taking in a small brief, but I think you take them in when you're like, I can see how we can build this business where the opportunities are, the client's got an appetite, try to kind of build things with you. That's good growth. You can see it. So it's not about like, we won't take on a small budget. I think it's about, is there appetite? Does the client want to grow something? Do they want to do good work? And being really clear about that, versus I think when you get a brief in, which is like, can you just, for this much money, activate this? And it's like, that genuinely doesn't often come to much. It's often quite over-serviced. We end up doing more than we should. And it can get your agency into quite a difficult position when you start to kind of get into that spiral of doing work which isn't profitable. It takes sucking people's time and attention away from other clients. So it's a careful balance at the moment, because I think you don't want to get into that position, because it sort of compromises other parts of your business and the client work as well.
Yeah, I can see there's a bit of a parallel with what we were talking about earlier on about projects. That sense that projects are less useful because you need that long-term relationship, because then it's just so much, more efficient and more effective. Yeah. It's a bit like this, really, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. As I say, it's not that we're reverse taking on a project, but I think when it's like something that has potential to grow or evolve, versus those kind of very, very siloed opportunities.
I was going to ask, really, going back to the merger, do you think many people see themselves still as Golin and Ketchum? And at what point do you think that will stop?
It was really interesting, actually, because I think, I don't know, like I see myself with Golin Ketchum now, which is odd, because I'm not going to lie, it wasn't that long ago where I was thinking, gosh, like, how do I get myself into a space where even the name, do you know what I mean, kind of comes naturally. But it has. And I think actually, when you actually go into our organisation now and you sit on the floor, people have come in and said this. They're like, this does not feel like two separate organisations anymore. It really does feel like one organisation. So I don't think people are looking around going, I'm from this side or I'm from that side. I think we're very, very focused on our clients and actually bringing people together around this. And I think generally there, as I say, I think there's a genuine excitement about, it's really interesting, like getting to know these other people and kind of creating this new organisation and the new opportunities that come with it. So yeah, don't think people are too distracted by like where they've been and what they've done or what they've been part of. I think people are quite focused on what's coming next.
Great. Well, it sounds like a good time to end it. So thank you so much, Ondine. I really appreciate it. There's so many good points and really interesting to hear how it's going. I'm glad that things are doing well so far. So yeah, great to see you and all the best for the rest of the year.
Perfect. Thanks, John.
No problem at all. And as always, thanks to everyone for listening. And until next time, goodbye.